The train lurches to a halt at a platform that no longer exists. The whistle echoes through valleys where no tracks remain. In the high peaks of the Ramapo Mountains, where eagles once circled above terraced gardens and champagne flowed beneath hand-carved ceilings, there stands, nothing. Or rather, something far more haunting than nothing, fragments. Stone walls embracing only air. Staircases ascending to sky. The skeletal remains of what was once called the most magnificent private estate in America. This is Arden House, the mountain palace of the Harriman dynasty. And if you've never heard of it, that's precisely the point. Some legacies are meant to fade. Others are deliberately erased. But the stones remember. The mountains remember. And tonight, we're going to remember too. Edward Henry Harriman arrived in New York City in 1862 at age 14 with $5 in his pocket and ambition burning in his chest like locomotive coal. The son of an impoverished Episcopal minister, he carried with him the particular hunger of those who have watched wealth from a distance, nose pressed against the glass of privilege, breathing fog onto a window they couldn't open. Wall Street in the 1860s was a savage place, a financial coliseum where fortunes were made and destroyed before lunch, where grown men wept into their collars and boys became wolves. Young Edward found work as an office runner, his legs churning through the cobblestone canyons of lower Manhattan, delivering messages and stock certificates, watching, always watching, learning the language of capital the way a prisoner learns the routine of his guards. By 22, he had saved enough, through means both frugal and ruthless, to purchase a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. A seat. Think about that. In an era when most men his age were still apprentices, still deferring to masters, Edward Henry Harriman owned a literal seat at the table of American wealth. But sitting wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. He could taste something in the air of that exchange floor, something metallic and intoxicating, the future, arriving on iron rails. The American railroad in the late 19th century wasn't merely transportation infrastructure. It was the very circulatory system of a growing nation, pumping commerce and people and possibility into previously unreachable arteries of the continent. Control the railroads, and you controlled movement itself. Control movement, and you controlled everything. Harriman saw this with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. While other financiers were content to speculate, to gamble on margin and rumor, Harriman began acquiring actual railroad companies, restructuring them with surgical precision, eliminating waste, optimizing routes, undercutting competitors until they capitulated or collapsed. He was not a kind man. Let's establish that immediately. The historical record, scrubbed though it may be by family archivists and sympathetic biographers, cannot fully erase the trail of broken strikes, crushed unions, workers maimed by unsafe conditions that Harriman deemed acceptable losses, in the pursuit of efficiency. When the Union Pacific Railroad teetered on the edge of bankruptcy in 1897, Harriman orchestrated its acquisition and transformation with the cold brilliance of a surgeon removing a cancer, necessary, perhaps, but without anesthesia, without mercy. Tracks were rerouted. Entire towns built around railroad depots found themselves suddenly bypassed, left to wither like branches severed from the tree. Thousands of workers were dismissed, their labor rendered obsolete by Harriman's modernization. He rebuilt the Union Pacific into one of the most profitable railroads in American history. The cost in human terms was rarely calculated in the ledgers. By 1900, Edward Henry Harriman controlled the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Illinois Central, the Central of Georgia, and significant portions of the Baltimore and Ohio. His railroad empire stretched across 45% of the United States. 45%. He could travel from New York to San Francisco on tracks he owned, through landscapes that moved to rhythms he dictated. The Harriman fortune was estimated at $70 to $100 million, somewhere between $2 to $3 billion in modern currency, though even that comparison feels inadequate. In an era before income tax, before antitrust enforcement had teeth, before regulatory oversight constrained the ambitions of men like Harriman, such wealth represented something closer to absolute power. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Because Edward Henry Harriman, this titan of rail and ruthless accumulator of capital, possessed a peculiar romanticism buried beneath his calculating exterior. In 1879, he married Mary Williamson Averill, daughter of a prominent banker, a woman of refinement and education who brought to the marriage not just social connections but a profound love of nature, of beauty, of the idea that wealth could be transformed into something more than numbers in a ledger. Mary would prove to be the architect of the Harriman family's cultural legacy, the conscience perhaps that Edward's business dealings had systematically suppressed. Together, they began searching for a summer retreat, an escape from the suffocating heat and coal smoke of Manhattan, from the relentless pressure of the financial world. The fashionable choice would have been Newport, where the Vanderbilts and Astors maintained their cottages, those absurd 50-room marble palaces overlooking the Atlantic. But Mary Harriman wanted something different. She wanted wilderness. She wanted mountains. She wanted a place where her children could roam free, where the air tasted of pine instead of industrial ambition. And Edward, for all his ruthlessness, could deny his wife very little. In 1885, they discovered it, 7,800 acres of rugged, heavily forested land straddling the Ramapo Mountains in southern New York, less than 50 miles from Manhattan yet utterly untamed. The property had been part of the Patterson family holdings, land that had seen Native American settlements, colonial farms, Revolutionary War skirmishes, and iron mining operations that left the mountains pockmarked with abandoned shafts and crumbling furnaces. It was beautiful in a wild, almost aggressive way, steep slopes thick with oak and hemlock, streams tumbling over moss-covered boulders, rocky outcroppings that offered views across 3 states. The locals called it unpromising land, too steep for proper farming, too remote for development. Mary Harriman called it perfect. Edward purchased the entire tract for a sum that contemporary accounts describe as substantial but not excessive, the language of wealth attempting modesty. They named it Arden, after the forest in Shakespeare's As You Like It, that enchanted woodland where exiled nobility found freedom and truth stripped of courtly pretense. The symbolism was either profoundly self-aware or breathtakingly ironic. Here was one of America's wealthiest, most powerful men, architect of monopolistic empire, seeking refuge in a literary landscape associated with escape from corruption and the restorative power of nature. Was it genuine longing for redemption, or simply the aesthetic preference of a man who could afford any metaphor he chose? Initially, the Harrimans built a relatively modest summer home, relative, of course, being a term that shifts meaning dramatically when applied to railroad magnates. This first Arden House was substantial, perhaps 40 rooms, but constructed of wood in a rambling, comfortable style more cottage than palace. The family spent summers there throughout the 1890s, and Mary began transforming the property according to her vision. She hired landscape architects to create paths and gardens that worked with the natural topography rather than against it. She established working farms on the more gentle slopes, dairy cattle, orchards, vegetable gardens, envisioning a kind of self-sufficient mountain estate. She brought in foresters to manage the woodland sustainably, one of the earliest examples of scientific forestry practice on a private estate in America. But more importantly, Mary opened the property. She allowed local families to hike the trails, to picnic by the streams, to gather berries in season. She established nature education programs, bringing students from New York City to learn about ecology and conservation. Arden became a kind of commons, unusual for an era when great estates were typically fortified against the intrusion of ordinary people. This generosity would later be interpreted cynically, a public relations gesture from a family whose fortune depended on public complicity, but those who experienced it spoke of genuine warmth, of Mrs. Harriman personally greeting visitors, of feeling, for a few hours, that beauty and wilderness weren't exclusively the province of the wealthy. Then, on September 9, 1909, Edward Henry Harriman died. He was 61 years old, his body worn down by years of relentless work, of 16-hour days and transcontinental journeys, of the particular stress that comes from maintaining an empire through sheer force of will. The official cause was stomach cancer, though some contemporary observers whispered about the toll of various tonics and medications common among overworked executives of the era. He died at Arden, in the house he'd built to escape the world that had made him, surrounded by mountains he'd purchased but could never truly possess. His death sent shockwaves through American finance. Stock markets trembled. Competitors and protégés alike scrambled to claim pieces of the empire. But the Harriman fortune remained largely intact, held together by family trusts and the iron determination of Mary Harriman, who proved to be as formidable in widowhood as her husband had been in business. She inherited everything: the railroads, the investments, the property, the power. And she immediately began planning something extraordinary. Mary decided to build a new Arden House, a structure that would serve as both family home and public monument, a place that would honor Edward's ambition while embodying her own values of service, education, and conservation. But she wouldn't build it in the valley where the original house stood. No. She chose a site on the summit of Arden Mountain itself, nearly 1,400 feet above sea level, a rocky prominence that required blasting and grading and extraordinary engineering just to create a building platform. Why there? Why make everything so impossibly difficult? Perhaps because difficulty was the point. Perhaps because building a palace on a mountaintop was the ultimate expression of both grief and defiance, grief for a husband who had moved mountains metaphorically, defiance against a world that expected widows to retreat quietly into mourning and irrelevance. Or perhaps Mary Harriman simply looked at that summit, at the three-state view it commanded, at the eagles circling on thermals, and thought, yes. Here. Let the world see what we built. Let them see beauty and power don't have to be separate things. She hired a consortium of architects, though the primary designer was William Whetten Renwick, nephew of the famous James Renwick Jr. who had designed St. Patrick's Cathedral and the original Smithsonian Castle. The brief was unprecedented: create a summer residence for the Harriman family that could also function as a retreat center, conference facility, and educational institution. It must accommodate up to 100 overnight guests. It must contain private family quarters, public gathering spaces, libraries, lecture halls, recreational facilities, and staff wings. It must be fireproof. It must incorporate the latest in electrical, plumbing, and heating technology. It must be built into and around the living rock of the mountaintop. And it must be beautiful. Above all, it must be beautiful. The design that emerged was something entirely unique in American architecture, part Renaissance Italian villa, part English country manor, part Adirondack great camp, and part something that had never existed before. The central structure would be 4 stories of granite and brick, with stucco facades in warm earth tones. Twin towers would anchor each end, giving the building a castle-like presence against the sky. The main entrance would face south, opening onto a vast terrace overlooking the valley. The north side would be built directly into the mountaintop, its lower floors essentially carved from the mountain itself, rooms excavated from solid rock. Construction began in 1910 and immediately became an engineering marvel and a logistical nightmare. Remember, this was a mountaintop with no road access, no water supply, no electricity, no infrastructure whatsoever. Everything, every stone block, every timber beam, every window pane, every nail, had to be transported up a mountain via a specially constructed funicular railway. Workers lived in temporary camps on the slopes, enduring brutal conditions. During the foundation excavation, they encountered more solid rock than anticipated, requiring weeks of additional blasting with black powder and dynamite. One worker was killed in an explosion. Another fell from scaffolding. Their names weren't recorded in the official histories. The stones were laid regardless. The funicular itself was an impressive feat, a cable railway running nearly a mile up the steep north face of Arden Mountain, powered by a steam engine at the base. It could carry loads of up to 5 tons, but moved slowly, grinding upward at perhaps 2 miles per hour. Some materials were too large even for the funicular and had to be hauled by teams of horses and human laborers along switchback trails cut into the mountainside. Local men found employment during the construction, as did immigrant workers from New York City, Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, German carpenters, a human catalogue of America's working class building a palace for the elite that controlled their livelihoods. The expense was staggering even by Harriman standards. Contemporary estimates placed the cost at $4 million, roughly $120 million today, for a summer house. A summer house. But calling Arden House simply a residence misses the point as profoundly as calling a cathedral merely a building with a roof. This was architecture as statement, as monument, as crystallized aspiration. Mary Harriman was building her vision of what American wealth could be, not just opulent, but purposeful, not just powerful, but generous, not just impressive, but transformative. The interior design matched the ambition of the structure. The entrance hall featured a grand staircase of hand-carved oak, each newel post topped with a bronze lantern. The walls were clad in wormy chestnut paneling, a wood now extinct due to the chestnut blight that would soon devastate American forests. The main living room, they called it the Great Hall, was 60 feet long with a 30-foot cathedral ceiling supported by massive timber trusses. A stone fireplace dominated one end, large enough to burn logs that required 2 men to carry. The opposite end featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley, the forest canopy spreading below like a green ocean, the Hudson River glinting in the distance. There was a library with 10,000 volumes, including first editions and rare manuscripts. A dining room that could seat 50, with hand-painted murals depicting scenes from the Arden Forest. A music room with a pipe organ and acoustics designed by the same consultant who worked on Carnegie Hall. Bedrooms for family and guests featured private bathrooms, still a luxury in 1913, with marble fixtures and the latest plumbing. The family quarters included sitting rooms, private studies, sewing rooms, nurseries designed with meticulous attention to light and ventilation. This was before modern pediatric understanding, but Mary Harriman instinctively grasped that children needed sun and air. But perhaps most revealing were the spaces designed for communal gathering and education. A lecture hall with tiered seating and a projection booth for the new, moving pictures. A gymnasium with basketball court and indoor swimming pool. Workshop spaces for crafts and manual training. A vast industrial kitchen capable of preparing 3 meals daily for 100 guests. Staff quarters that, while certainly hierarchical and far less grand than the main house, were by contemporary standards quite decent, private rooms for senior staff, dormitory-style but well-ventilated spaces for others, staff dining rooms, recreation areas. Mary Harriman believed in service, but she also believed, or wanted to believe, that service could be dignified. The grounds were landscaped with the same combination of vision and engineering that characterized the main house. Formal Italian gardens were created on terraces carved into the mountainside, requiring the transportation of thousands of tons of topsoil up the mountain. Fountains were fed by an elaborate system that captured and pressurized water from mountain springs. Walking paths wound through carefully preserved natural areas. A 9-hole golf course was somehow carved into and around the rocky terrain. Imagine the audacity, the sheer excess of blasting and grading a mountaintop to make it suitable for a leisure activity invented by Scottish shepherds. There was a working farm in the valley below, linked to the main house by the funicular and by road. The farm supplied fresh dairy, vegetables, and meat, managed according to the latest agricultural science. Orchards produced apples, pears, and stone fruits. A forestry operation selectively harvested timber while maintaining forest health. Mary Harriman was attempting to create a model of sustainable estate management, proving that wealth could be maintained without exhausting the land. Whether this was genuine progressivism or simply enlightened self-interest remains debatable. Sustaining the land sustained the value of her investment, after all. Arden House was completed in late 1913, and the Harriman family took up residence the following summer. But by then, the world that had made the Harriman fortune possible was beginning its terminal collapse. In Europe, the old imperial powers were sliding toward catastrophic war. In America, the progressive movement was gaining strength, passing antitrust legislation, breaking up monopolies, imposing income tax for the first time in the nation's history. The age of unconstrained robber baron capitalism, the golden era that produced fortunes like the Harrimans, was ending. And Mary Harriman, perhaps sensing this, had already begun transforming Arden into something that could outlast that era. She established the Arden Foundation in 1912, dedicating the estate to the promotion of social welfare and education. She invited organizations and groups to use Arden House for conferences and retreats, often at no cost. The Boy Scouts came. The YWCA came. Labor unions, yes, labor unions, those organizations her husband had spent decades crushing, came to hold leadership training sessions. Educational reform groups. Public health organizations. Suffragettes planning strategy for women's voting rights. The mountain palace built with railroad money became a gathering place for movements that challenged the very systems that had generated that money. Was this hypocrisy? Was it guilt? Was it a sophisticated form of social control, allowing reformers their mountain retreat while the fundamental structures of wealth and power remained intact? Or was it genuine evolution, a woman and a family trying to use their resources towards something better than mere accumulation? History doesn't offer clean answers. The Harrimans continued living with extraordinary privilege: servants, private rail cars, multiple homes, insulation from every hardship that touched ordinary Americans. But they also gave away millions to universities, hospitals, parks, and causes that genuinely helped people. Both things can be true. Both things are true. During World War I, Arden House became a training facility for the Red Cross. Mary Harriman was appointed to the National Red Cross Board and threw herself into war relief work with the same energy she'd applied to building her mountain estate. The great hall where orchestras had played chamber music now echoed with nursing instruction. The terraced gardens where guests had sipped champagne became teaching spaces for emergency medical procedures. Young women from across New York and New England came to Arden, lived in the guest rooms, learned to roll bandages and treat shock and manage field hospitals, then shipped out to France where many of them witnessed horrors that Mary Harriman, for all her progressive sympathies, could barely imagine from her mountaintop sanctuary. The 1920s brought a different energy to Arden. Mary's children were now adults, and each had inherited some portion of their parents' driving ambition. Averell Harriman, the eldest son, was building his own business empire, though with more polish and public relations savvy than his father. He would eventually become a significant political figure, serving as ambassador to the Soviet Union and governor of New York. Roland Harriman took over management of the railroad investments, stabilizing and expanding the family fortune through the turbulent post-war economy. The daughters married well, to bankers, to industrialists, to men who could match the Harriman standard of wealth and influence. Arden House during this period functioned almost as an American Versailles, a place where business and politics and society intermingled at garden parties and golf tournaments and elaborate dinners. Supreme Court justices mingled with railroad executives. Progressive politicians debated corporate titans. Artists and intellectuals were invited to add cultural legitimacy, their presence suggesting that the Harrimans weren't merely rich but refined, not simply powerful but enlightened. It was the American elite at its apex, the last gasp of a Gilded Age trying desperately to prove it deserved to exist. But beneath the elegant surface, maintenance of Arden House was becoming increasingly problematic. The very features that made it magnificent, the remote location, the massive scale, the integration with raw nature, also made it phenomenally expensive to maintain. The funicular required constant repair. The steam heating system consumed enormous amounts of coal, all of which had to be transported up the mountain. The Italian gardens needed battalions of gardeners. The building itself, exposed to brutal mountain weather, required ongoing work to prevent water damage, freeze damage, wind damage. An estate that size typically employed between 50 and 70 full-time staff just for basic operations, groundskeepers, maintenance crews, kitchen staff, housekeepers, valets, chauffeurs, secretaries. During peak summer season, that number could swell past 100. Who were these people? What were their lives like, these invisible workers who made Harriman luxury possible? Historical records are, as always, frustratingly sparse about people whose labor was considered unremarkable. But fragments remain. The estate employed local families from the surrounding Ramapo area, people whose ancestors had worked in the iron mines, farmed the marginal land, eked out livings from the unforgiving landscape. For them, Harriman employment meant stability, decent wages by rural standards, sometimes even a sense of pride in maintaining something beautiful. But it also meant hierarchies as rigid as any military organization, with head butlers and housekeepers enforcing elaborate rules about movement and behavior, about which spaces could be entered and when, about absolute invisibility whenever the family was present. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and suddenly the economic realities shifted seismically. The Harriman fortune survived, vast wealth, properly managed, can weather almost any storm, but the social climate changed. Ostentatious displays of wealth became not just unfashionable but potentially dangerous. There were labor strikes, breadlines, desperate people willing to do desperate things. Security at Arden increased. The gates that had been symbolically open now had actual guards. The mountain palace that Mary Harriman had hoped would be a place of learning and mixing of classes became, necessarily, more fortress-like. Mary Williamson Averill Harriman died in 1932 at age 73. She had lived to see her husband's fortune transformed into something more complex than mere money, had seen her mountain vision fully realized, had hosted presidents and paupers in her magnificent house on the rock. She died at Arden, in a bedroom overlooking the valley she'd loved, surrounded by children who would carry the Harriman name into a new era. But she also died knowing that the world she'd built for was vanishing. The age of the great private estates was ending. The taxes, the maintenance costs, the simple impossibility of maintaining such places in an increasingly democratic society, all of it was becoming unsustainable. The family continued using Arden House through the 1930s, but less frequently, and with less grandeur. The Depression made elaborate entertaining seem grotesque. World War II made it seem unpatriotic. Younger generations of Harrimans had their own interests, their own lives in Manhattan or Washington or abroad. The estate began showing signs of neglect, not dramatic collapse, but small failures that hinted at larger problems. Paint peeling. Gutters clogging. Gardens growing wild. The slow entropy that claims all things when attention falters. In 1950, facing impossible maintenance costs and changing family priorities, the Harrimans made a decision that would seem to validate Mary's original vision while simultaneously ending it. They donated most of the Arden estate, including Arden House itself, to Columbia University, which was looking for a retreat and conference facility for its business school. The donation was structured with careful tax advantages, of course, but it was also genuine philanthropy. The university agreed to maintain the property according to the family's original educational vision, and to keep Mary Harriman's name attached to various programs and facilities. Columbia took possession and immediately faced the same brutal economics that had overwhelmed the Harrimans. The university poured money into necessary repairs and modernization. They used Arden House for executive education programs, hosting corporate leadership retreats and academic conferences. It was perfect for such purposes, isolated, impressive, equipped with lodging and meeting facilities. For 2 decades, business executives came to the mountain to learn about management theory and strategic planning, sleeping in rooms that had housed railroad barons, eating in a dining room built with railroad money, perhaps never considering the irony of studying capitalism in a palace capitalism had built and couldn't sustain. But by the 1970s, even Columbia University's resources were stretched. The maintenance costs were staggering. The location, once charmingly remote, now seemed merely inconvenient in an age of jet travel and modern conference centers with climate control and reliable infrastructure. The funicular had been replaced by a road, but the road was steep and prone to closure in bad weather. The heating system, antiquated despite upgrades, consumed fuel at unconscionable rates during the energy crisis. The building itself was showing its age, not charmingly, but structurally. Water infiltration was causing damage to the irreplaceable wooden elements. The pool leaked. The pipe organ was silent. The library books were molding. Philosophical questions also emerged. Should a university, particularly a private institution already facing criticism about elitism, maintain a mountaintop palace for the benefit of corporate executives? Was this really the best use of educational resources? Student activists protested Columbia's ownership of Arden, seeing it as a symbol of the university's complicity with corporate power. They weren't entirely wrong. The symbolism was troubling, educating the elite in a palace built by an previous generation's elite, perpetuating cycles of privilege wrapped in the language of meritocracy. In 1977, Columbia University quietly decided to divest itself of Arden House. The property was sold to a private foundation connected to the Unification Church, which used it for several years as a retreat and education center. Then it changed hands again. And again. Each subsequent owner faced the same impossible mathematics: the cost of maintenance vastly exceeded any reasonable use value. Each tried different approaches. Turn it into a luxury hotel. Make it a corporate retreat center. Develop the land. But the zoning restrictions, the historic preservation designations, the sheer logistical challenges of operating anything on that mountaintop made every plan unworkable. By the 1990s, Arden House stood mostly empty. The elegant furniture had been sold at auction. The library dispersed. The paintings removed. What remained was the shell, the extraordinary architectural bones, still magnificent but increasingly decrepit. Vandals broke in, smashing windows, spray-painting walls. Copper pipes and wiring were stripped out by thieves, the ancient criminal tradition of harvesting value from abandoned grandeur. Weather continued its patient work, water finding every crack and crevice, freezing and expanding, slowly prying apart what had taken years to build. The local community watched this decline with mixed emotions. Some felt sadness: it had been a landmark, a source of local pride and employment. Others felt a kind of bitter satisfaction: let the monument to excessive wealth decay, let nature reclaim what should never have been built there anyway. There were occasional proposals for restoration, for adaptive reuse, but they all foundered on financial reality. To properly restore and maintain Arden House would require tens of millions of dollars, and for what? To create another museum of Gilded Age excess. There were already too many of those. To create a functional space. There were far cheaper ways to build conference facilities. In 2002, Arden House and the surrounding land were sold once more, this time to the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, a bi-state agency managing parkland in New York and New Jersey. This seemed like potential salvation: return the land to public use, honor Mary Harriman's original vision of accessible natural beauty. The Park Commission had ambitions to restore the house, or at least stabilize it, to make it available for tours and limited public use. Plans were drawn up. Grants were applied for. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit, and suddenly state park budgets were being slashed across the country. The Arden House restoration project was indefinitely postponed. Today, Arden House stands in a state of arrested decay, a haunted space caught between preservation and abandonment. The Park Commission maintains basic security, fencing, occasional patrols, to keep out vandals and the curious. But there's no money for actual restoration, no clear vision for what the building could or should become. The structure itself remains remarkably sound: that granite and brick construction, that foundation literally carved from mountain rock, has resisted collapse despite decades of neglect. But the interior is ruined. The beautiful chestnut paneling warped and water-stained. The painted murals faded and peeling. The Great Hall, where orchestras once played and labor organizers once debated, now home only to pigeons and the occasional raccoon. The terraced Italian gardens are wild thickets. The fountains dry cisterns. The golf course has returned to forest, nature erasing human presumption one sapling at a time. You can hike to Arden House today, if you're willing to navigate the trail system and ignore the "no trespassing" signs that are enforced only sporadically. People do. Photographers seeking the melancholic beauty of ruins. Historians documenting what remains. Local teenagers looking for a place to drink beer and tell ghost stories. And yes, ghost stories have accumulated around the abandoned mansion: phantom piano music, the sound of dinner parties echoing through empty halls, a woman in Victorian dress seen in upper windows. Every great ruin attracts such stories. They're probably nonsense. They're probably true in every way that matters. What do we make of the Harriman Mountain Palace now, from our vantage point more than a century after its construction? It's tempting to see it as simply a morality tale about excessive wealth and inevitable decline, about the hubris of building monuments to privilege. And certainly that reading is valid. The Harriman fortune was built on the backs of workers who had no choice, no power, no share in the wealth their labor created. The mountain palace was constructed by people who couldn't afford to visit as guests. The whole apparatus of Gilded Age grandeur depended on and required massive inequality. But dismissing Arden House as merely a temple to excess misses its complexity. Mary Harriman genuinely tried to create something more than a private pleasure palace. The educational programs were real. The conservation practices were forward-thinking. The opening of the estate to various groups represented a kind of progressive vision, however limited by the prejudices and paternalism of its era. Yes, she operated from a position of enormous privilege, but she used that privilege in ways that many of her peers did not. She could have built her mountain mansion and kept it entirely private, a fortress against the world. She chose differently. And the building itself, regardless of the moral complexities of its creation, represented a remarkable achievement. The architects and engineers and craftspeople who built Arden House created something genuinely beautiful, something that worked with and celebrated the natural landscape rather than simply dominating it. The integration of building and mountain, the careful attention to views and light, the quality of materials and execution, these things have value beyond their association with wealth. Beauty doesn't require moral purity to be beautiful. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Arden House story is how it reveals the impermanence of even the grandest gestures. Edward Henry Harriman controlled nearly half the railroads in America, moved markets with a word, built an empire that seemed eternal. It lasted barely a generation beyond his death. Mary Harriman created a mountain palace that was supposed to serve education and social good for centuries. It was effectively abandoned within 60 years of completion. The stones remain, but stones without purpose are just stones. The mountain, meanwhile, persists. The forest has reclaimed most of what the Harrimans cleared. The streams they dammed and redirected have found their old courses or cut new ones. The wildlife they displaced has returned, deer, bear, turkey, coyote, even the occasional eagle circling on thermals above the ruined mansion. Nature is patient. Nature always wins eventually. Every palace becomes a ruin, every garden returns to wilderness, every empire crumbles into archaeology. But here's what haunts me most about Arden House, the people whose stories were never recorded. The workers who blasted rock and hauled stones and fell from scaffolding, their names lost because their labor was considered unremarkable. The servants who spent their lives maintaining someone else's luxury, their experiences deemed unworthy of historical preservation. The local families whose land was purchased and incorporated into the estate, their agricultural lives disrupted by railroad money and aristocratic vision. The children from the city who came for nature education programs and perhaps glimpsed, for a moment, a world beyond tenement walls, what became of them? These are the invisible people, the ones history forgets because they lacked wealth to leave monuments, lacked power to shape narratives, lacked the privilege of being considered historically significant. They built Arden House more than the Harrimans did. They maintained it. They made it function. And when it was abandoned, they were the ones who lost employment, lost connection to a place that had perhaps meant something to them despite its associations with inequality. There's a photograph I've seen from approximately 1917, the image quality is poor, as photographs from that era often are, but the scene is clear enough. It shows the full staff of Arden House posed on the front terrace, arranged in careful hierarchy. The family is in the center, seated in elegant furniture that's been brought outside for the photograph. Around and behind them, standing in neat rows, are perhaps 70 staff members, chauffeurs in their caps, gardeners in their work clothes, housekeepers in severe black dresses, kitchen staff in white aprons. Everyone is looking at the camera. And what strikes you, looking at this photograph across a century's distance, is how many faces there are. How many lives, each with their own dreams and disappointments. Each a full human story reduced to a figure in someone else's portrait. What were their names? What did they think about as they stood there, waiting for the photographer to capture the exposure? Did they feel pride in their association with Harriman grandeur, or resentment at their subordinate position? Did the young kitchen maid in the back row ever wonder what it would be like to sleep in one of those magnificent bedrooms, or had she trained herself never to think such thoughts? Did the groundskeeper who'd spent 20 years maintaining the gardens imagine those gardens abandoned, overgrown, his life's work vanishing into wilderness? We'll never know. Their voices are lost. History preserved the Harriman story, the vision, the wealth, the architectural achievement. But it discarded the stories of those who actually made that achievement possible. This is what power does. It writes itself into permanence while rendering its dependencies invisible. The Arden House ruins are scheduled for yet another assessment in the coming years. There's periodic talk of restoration, of adaptive reuse, of finding some way to make the property self-sustaining through tourism or events or education programs. The plans are earnest, well-intentioned, probably doomed. The fundamental problem remains unchanged: the costs are too high, the location too inconvenient, the symbolism too fraught. We live in an era that's ambivalent about monuments to Gilded Age wealth. We want to preserve them as historical artifacts, but we're uncomfortable celebrating them. We recognize their architectural and artistic value while acknowledging the systems of exploitation that made them possible. Perhaps the truest fate for Arden House is to remain a ruin, neither restored to glory nor completely erased. Let it stand as a monument to ambiguity, to the complexity of wealth and power and human aspiration. Let it be a place where the grandeur and the injustice coexist in the same stones, where you can admire the craftsmanship while mourning the system that made it possible. Let the forest gradually reclaim it, nature performing its slow work of judgment. Because here's what the Harriman Mountain Palace teaches us: if we're willing to learn, everything is temporary. The wealth that seems unassailable will dissipate. The monuments that seem eternal will crumble. The power that seems absolute will fade. But the mountain remains. The forest remains. The stream cutting its patient way through rock remains. And perhaps that's the lesson, not that human ambition is pointless, but that it must be measured against geological time, against the deep patience of the natural world. Edward Henry Harriman thought he was building a railroad empire that would last forever. It lasted decades. Mary Harriman thought she was creating an educational institution that would serve generations. It served one generation, maybe two, before economics and changing values rendered it obsolete. Both believed, with the certainty of their class and era, that their vision would outlast them, that their wealth could purchase a kind of immortality. They were wrong. We're all wrong when we think like that. The stones of Arden House will eventually collapse, reduced to rubble and archaeological curiosity. The Harriman name, once synonymous with American power, now means little outside historical circles. The railroad empire has been absorbed into larger corporations, its identity erased by mergers and acquisitions. The fortune has been divided and subdivided across generations of descendants until it's merely wealth rather than dynasty. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the only honest response to the Harriman Mountain Palace is to let it go, to let time and weather and entropy do their work. Not in anger or judgment, but in recognition that this is the nature of things. We build, we dream, we create beauty and injustice in equal measure, and then we're gone. What remains is subject to forces beyond our control, interpreted by people we'll never know, judged by standards we can't anticipate. The train no longer stops at a platform that no longer exists. The whistle no longer echoes through valleys where tracks no longer run. But the mountains remember. In the ruins of staircases ascending to sky, in stone walls embracing only air, in the ghost of an Italian garden returning to forest, in the slow patient work of moss and rain and wind dismantling what wealth built and time forgot. The mountains remember what we were, what we dreamed, what we achieved and what we cost. And they will remember long after every last stone of Arden House has tumbled down the slope, rejoining the mountain that never really accepted its palace anyway, returning to the earth from which it was so laboriously extracted by people whose names we never knew, whose labor we never properly valued, whose stories we never thought to preserve. This is the legacy of the Harriman Mountain Palace. Not the grandeur or the decline, not the wealth or the waste, but the lesson written in ruins and reclaimed forest: we are temporary. Our monuments are temporary. Only the mountains and the mountain's patience last. And maybe, just maybe, if we remember that, we'll build differently. Dream differently. Value differently. Not palaces on mountaintops to glorify individual ambition, but structures that serve common good, that honor the labor that builds them, that recognize all human stories as worthy of preservation, not just the stories of those who could afford to carve their names in stone. The eagles still circle above Arden Mountain. They don't care about Harriman history, about railroad empires or architectural ambition. They ride the thermals, hunt the forests, nest in the crags that knew this landscape long before humans arrived and will know it long after we're gone. Perhaps we should learn from their indifference. Perhaps the greatest wisdom is to build beautifully, dream boldly, but never believe our dreams will outlast the wind. The irony, of course, is that we can't stop building monuments. It's fundamentally human, this need to leave marks, to say, I was here, I mattered, remember me. Even in our modern age of supposed egalitarianism and democratic values, we continue constructing monuments to wealth and power, though we've learned to disguise them better, to wrap them in the language of innovation or sustainability or public benefit. The tech campuses in Silicon Valley, the hedge fund towers in Manhattan, the gated compounds spreading across every landscape where wealth accumulates, these are our era's Arden houses, our mountain palaces. We tell ourselves they're different, that they serve productive purposes rather than mere ostentation. But functionally, they perform the same work: they separate, they elevate, they proclaim that some lives matter more than others, that some dreams deserve stone and glass while others make do with whatever remains. And when these structures inevitably fail, when the tech companies collapse or relocate, when the hedge funds dissolve, when the economic logic that sustained them evaporates, we'll express the same surprise, the same regret about maintenance costs and changed priorities. Future generations will photograph their ruins, write essays about their hubris, construct the same moral narratives we now apply to Gilded Age excess. The cycle continues because the fundamental human impulses haven't changed: the desire for permanence, for legacy, for some assurance that our brief spark of consciousness meant something beyond its moment. What's different about the Harriman story, what makes it particularly resonant, is Mary's attempt to interrupt that cycle, to transform private monument into public good before entropy demanded it. She failed, obviously. Arden House ended up abandoned regardless of her intentions. But the attempt itself represents something worth examining. She recognized, perhaps more clearly than her husband or her peers, that wealth without purpose was simply accumulated anxiety, that a fortune could buy everything except meaning. So she tried to create meaning by opening the gates, by inviting the labor organizers and the suffragettes and the students, by insisting that her mountain palace serve something beyond family aggrandizement. Was it enough? Of course not. No amount of philanthropic gesture can fully redeem wealth built on systemic exploitation. The railroad workers who died in unsafe conditions, the communities displaced by Harriman's route optimization, the competitors crushed and careers destroyed in the building of that empire, these injustices weren't meaningfully addressed by allowing Boy Scout troops to hike Arden's trails. Mary Harriman's progressive vision operated entirely within structures of privilege she never fundamentally challenged. She wanted wealth to be benevolent without ceasing to be wealth, wanted hierarchy to be humane without ceasing to be hierarchy. But perhaps we should be cautious about dismissing such efforts entirely, about demanding perfect moral purity from historical figures operating within imperfect systems. Because the alternative to Mary Harriman's flawed progressivism was people like dozens of her contemporaries who built equally grand estates and kept them entirely private, who spent their fortunes on yachts and jewels and European palaces, who never once questioned whether their wealth carried any obligation beyond their own enjoyment. At least she asked the question. At least she tried, however inadequately, to make her privilege serve purposes beyond itself. The real tragedy of Arden House isn't that it was built or that it fell into ruin. The real tragedy is what it represents about our inability to imagine alternatives. We've created economic systems that generate vast inequalities, that concentrate wealth beyond any individual's capacity to meaningfully use, and then we act surprised when that wealth manifests as excess, as waste, as monuments that future generations can't maintain and don't want. We shake our heads at railroad barons building mountain palaces while simultaneously defending the systems that made such concentrations of wealth possible, that continue making them possible. Edward Henry Harriman didn't invent capitalism or inequality. He simply operated within existing systems with exceptional ruthlessness and intelligence. Mary Harriman didn't invent philanthropy or progressive reform. She simply tried to ameliorate capitalism's harshest edges while enjoying its benefits. Both were products of their era, constrained by assumptions they couldn't see beyond. And we are exactly the same, operating within systems we consider natural and inevitable, unable to imagine alternatives, destined to be judged by future generations for blindness as we can't currently perceive. What would those future generations think, looking back at our ruins? What will they say about the gated communities and luxury condos standing empty after sea level rise, about the abandoned suburban sprawl returning to prairie, about the monuments to our particular form of excess? Will they shake their heads at our wastefulness, our short-sightedness, our inability to build for genuine human flourishing rather than profit extraction? Almost certainly. Just as certainly, they'll have their own blindnesses, their own systems of injustice they've naturalized, their own monuments they believe will last forever. There's a kind of liberation in accepting this, in recognizing that historical judgment is inevitable and ultimately beside the point. We don't build for posterity's approval. We can't. We can only build according to the values and possibilities available to us, within our historical moment, acknowledging our limitations while striving towards something better. The Harrimans built a mountain palace because that's what their era, their wealth, their imagination made possible. We should neither celebrate them uncritically nor condemn them absolutely, but rather try to understand what their choices reveal about the possibilities and constraints of their moment, and, by extension, of ours. Arden House stands ruined on its mountain, teaching its patient lesson to anyone willing to climb the trail and sit among the stones. The lesson isn't simple. It's not, wealth is bad, or monuments are folly, or nature always wins. It's something more complex, more uncomfortable, that we are all complicit in systems larger than ourselves, that our choices matter and don't matter simultaneously, that beauty and injustice can coexist in the same stones, that everything we build will eventually fail but we must build anyway, must dream anyway, must try to create meaning within the brief flash of consciousness we're granted. The forest continues its patient reclamation. Vines climb through broken windows. Saplings root in cracked terraces. Birds nest in the great hall's timber trusses. And perhaps this, finally, is the most honest ending, not restoration to former glory, not complete erasure, but slow absorption back into the mountain that tolerated the palace for a century and will outlast its memory by millennia. The stones will tumble. The walls will fall. The mountain will forget the Harriman name, forget the railroad empire, forget everything except the ancient rhythms of weather and season and geologic time. We should visit while we can, while the ruins still stand enough to suggest what was, while we can still trace the outline of that extraordinary ambition. Not to celebrate it or condemn it, but to witness it, to let it complicate our understanding of wealth and power and human aspiration. To remember the names we know and mourn the names we don't. To stand in the great hall where orchestras played and labor leaders debated and ask ourselves what monuments we're building, what ruins we're leaving, what future archaeologists will conclude about our particular civilization's dreams and delusions. The train whistle is silent. The platform is gone. But if you climb Arden Mountain on the right kind of evening, when mist fills the valleys and the last light catches the broken stones just so, you can almost hear it, the echo of something grand and doomed, the ghost of a palace that thought it would last forever, the sound of time itself, patient and pitiless, reducing all our ambitions to rubble and wind and the slow green triumph of the forest reclaiming everything we thought we'd conquered.